Sometimes it's a little bit tricky to know if we don't have the transparency, and you could say, well, look, the regulators need to demand this, but if we don't really have the full transparency on where the data is coming from that is training these models, or who owns the data that is training these models, then it's difficult to even sort of reach into that from a regulatory perspective. But I am sure that as the AI story unfolds, we will need to have quite a range of regulatory tools and specificities for different aspects of the technologies. It's very unlikely to be the case that one regulatory regime will be suitable, even for what I was just saying, like having an AGI type destination or having a very domain-specific destination.
Welcome to AI, Government and the Future, a podcast by Corner Alliance. We explore the intersection of artificial intelligence, government and the future. We work with government to create results. We ignite your agency's mission by helping you to design and implement high-impact and innovative federal programs in AI, broadband, cybersecurity, public safety, and more. Being a government ally is at the core of all we do.
Welcome back to AI Government in the Future. I'm your host, Max Romanek, and today I'm excited to welcome Adrian Brown to the show. Adrian is the Executive Director of the Center for Public Impact, a foundation closely linked with the Boston Consulting Group, and a leading voice in the public sector transformation. With over 20 years of experience, Adrian has worked at the highest levels of government, including positions in the UK Prime Minister's Delivery Unit and the Prime Minister's Office. He's been instrumental in developing strategies that aim to enhance government performance and make a lasting positive impact on public services globally. Today, we'll be discussing how we can ensure that the benefits of AI are shared broadly across society, exploring the role of government, oversight, collaboration, and regulation to achieve these goals. Welcome to the show, Adrian.
Thanks, Max. It's great to be here.
As a means of getting us kicked off here, in your role as the Executive Director for the Center for Public Impact, you've worked on transformative projects around the world. I was hoping you could start by giving us some of the key initiatives you've been involved in that have significantly influenced how governments are integrating technology and AI for public service.
Yeah, sure. So I actually had to go back and look when we first started doing this topic earlier on today when I knew you were going to ask me this question. And it was actually 2017. So in AI years, that's a long time ago, right? 2017. And we started then with a piece of work which was under the sort of broader heading of AI and the future of government. We wrote a report called Destination Unknown, which I think was an appropriate title.
It's a hit song back then with that title too.
Even back then, we were talking already about how governments needed to prepare, as we were describing at that point, for the sort of rapid advancement of these technologies and how it was going to change the way government related to citizens broadly, how they went about policy making and how they went about the implementation of policy and public services. So already back then in 2017, we were starting to dip our toes into this space. We then followed that work up a year or two later with another report which focused more specifically on legitimacy and trust as two key factors associated with AI and digital technology more broadly. And then more recently, over the last few years, we've had a partnership with Google Foundation, the not-for-profit arm of Google, where we've run a whole series of challenges related to AI and different topics. So we started with AI and climate, and then we've done AI and social impact more broadly. We've done AI and the Sustainable Development Goals. And most recently, in fact, currently, we're just coming to the end of running a challenge on AI and improving trust and strengthening democracy. So we've really explored how AI can sort of intersect with all of those different aspects of government. And of course, these days, it's extremely fashionable if you talk about AI. So everybody's talking about AI. But I do like to think sort of back in the day, in 2017, we were one of the only voices at that time that was asking, how is this going to change the workings of government from the inside as well as sort of broader society? So that's the story that we've been involved with over the last few years.
Absolutely. Well, I love hearing the history of that and looking forward to bringing some of those topics current today in our discussion. I think that there's general consensus that AI really has the potential to really revolutionize public services. And so I have a two-part question for you to get us kicked off. And how can governments ensure that the benefits of AI innovation are distributed equitably? And then what factors would go into determining what equitable means in this context?
It's a good question. It's a hard question. Maybe it's worth, before we dive into the details of that, sort of taking one step back and asking, for the purpose of this conversation, sort of what we mean when we say AI, because a lot of people can mean a lot of different things about that. And then what roles government can play broadly. So at least when I'm talking about AI, I'm talking about the whole suite of technologies that are applying any form of learning and sort of advanced analytics to data broadly. So I'm casting a fairly wide net with this. But depending on what your attitude is, and let me put my cards on the table, I'm a bit of a techno-optimist when it comes to these technologies. People are anticipating, let's say in the next 5 to 10 years, we are going to see really rapid advancements in terms of AI, to the point that a lot of people are saying we might have something at or approaching AGI human level within a decade, right? That doesn't sound crazy anymore. So I think anybody who's in any walk of life, but especially those working in government, have to start to take seriously the prospect that these technologies are going to continue to accelerate at the pace that they're already improving at. And that in certainly the next 5-10 years, we might see levels of development that are going to make all sorts of things possible. So when I'm thinking about AI, I'm not just thinking about sort of ChatGPT and the state of the technologies today, the leading models today. I'm thinking that in 5 to 10 years' time, which is basically 1 or 2 electoral cycles in many countries, we're going to be seeing really significant advancements. So that's what government has to start anticipating. The other thing I'd say as a sort of framing for this is that government, of course, is a third to a half of most economies. Governments are huge. They do all sorts of different things. So in relation to AI in particular, I think they've got 4 different roles that they are playing at any point simultaneously. And depending on which conversation you're having with which constituency, you'll be talking about one or more of these roles. So those roles are developer. Governments can be developing their own AI technologies, be investing in these technologies directly themselves, often for sort of defense or cybersecurity reasons. They can be a user of AI technology. So that's about applying the tools that are being developed by whoever to improve bureaucracy and public service themselves. They can be a regulator. So they can be trying to set the rules of the game, if you like, so that society more broadly gets the benefits of AI technologies and avoids some of the downsides and risks. And fourth, this is sort of a slightly unusual one, but I'll use a word that I use and then we can explore it if you like, a sense maker. And by that, I mean governments have a role to play in helping societies to make sense of what is about to happen if we're going to see this sort of rapid technology. And that's different from the other 3 roles. It's sort of holding that space in which society can sort of understand the trade-offs, understand the risks, understand the implications societally of how these technologies are advancing. So as a developer, as a user of these technologies, as a regulator, and as a sense maker, government has a role to play. So your question was, what can governments do in relation to equity, right? And the equity implications of some of these technologies. And I think you can kind of tick through each of those different roles of government and say, well, look, as a developer of these technologies, government can be making sure that it is investing in developing systems for itself that will help to, I suppose, tip the balance, if that's required, in the direction of sort of the broader public interest and not just private interests who might be developing AI systems for other reasons, so that they can invest in these technologies themselves. As a user of these technologies, if they're applying them to healthcare, to education, to welfare, to justice, then of course they need to think about the biases, about the data sets, about the interpretability of decision-making in relation to any of these services. And that, of course, is an equity component. As a regulator, they need to make sure that it's not just sort of the 1% that's going to gain the benefits from these technologies, and that broadly societies will benefit from them, and the important regulatory aspects of that. And then as a sense maker, it's about making sure that everybody has a voice in a whole society discussion about the implications of all of this and sort of what's going to happen next in terms of any of those other roles. So government has a huge role to play, and it's not just the lawmakers, it's not just the bureaucrats, it's not just the frontline public servants, it's not just the technologists, it's everybody having to work in their own domains and work together, I guess, to iteratively over time sort of help us navigate this period. And that's why it's exciting. That's also why it's extremely challenging for government.
Each of those functions has sort of the overlapping Venn diagram of responsibility where one function bleeds into the next, will influence how that goes, depending on what the government has sponsored through research dollars. that might affect what the regulatory posture is towards those technologies and so forth. We do a lot of emergency management in our consultancy. And part of that is not just the response, but it's also the preparing side. And so that's where I really like that sense maker function that you talked about there, because that's all about pre-education, trying to demystify government response, helping prepare people for the realities of the world that they live in. Simply apply that to AI instead of a natural or man-made disaster. And we're right there in the core of what you're discussing. So I really appreciate the sort of basis that you answered that from. I guess my concern is that it is complicated, it is big, and the overlapping areas present some drift. You can sort of drive a truck through some of the cracks there. In the past, we've had plenty of harms befall us when regulatory mechanisms have failed. Do you feel like the consequences here are of equal measure, or having the regulatory function for like an AI set of process break down? Like, does that carry more risk with it than some of the other things? I'm thinking like the subprime mortgage crisis was a failure of regulations. What happens if we have a similar sort of set of assumptions in an AI space turn out to be false, and oops, the people who said they were like self-regulating, not so much?
This is a huge area. I've actually been a member of the World Economic Forum working group on regulations. I've been part of a discussion amongst a certain group of constituents anyway about how to think about this. But I have to say, I'm not an expert on regulation specifically. One obvious observation that one can make about this domain is that if you think about the clock speed of regulation, especially international regulation, because of course you can regulate this one constituency, but these are technologies that don't really recognize national or any other borders. But if you think generally about the clock speed of regulation, that is not really operating on the same learning cycle as these AI technologies are now developing. So if our model of regulation is one where we're going to try and, identify all of the possible loopholes or all of the possible risks or failure modes that we could envisage for these technologies, then we're going to be chasing after a technology that's just heading off over the horizon. So we're never going to be able to shut all those doors or close all those loopholes in time, because by the time we've realized what they are, we're done with. So I think we have to take a very adaptive, a very sort of open and more sort of anticipatory stance to our regulation with respect to AI. And that means acknowledging that we're not going to have everything buttoned up from the get-go, because we really do not know what the implications of all these technologies are. And unless we're willing to have a pause, which some people argue for about in terms of like AI development to allow everybody to catch up, I think we're going to have to accept the fact that regulators are, in some senses, always be playing catch-up, but to do that in a way that is trying to be as open and as learning-oriented, I suppose, as possible, which is to say, look, we'll set some principles, we'll set some values, I suppose, that we want represented that are important to society. Yes, around equity, around fairness, around transparency, around interpretability. And those values may not be as bright line as they could be if we had like 20 years to really think about this and work all this up. But they at least provide some guidelines, some sort of railroad tracks for the sector to, I suppose, orient itself towards, and for society and lawmakers and civil society and others who've got a voice in this to be able to at least have an ongoing conversation as they observe how these technologies are actually playing out, what the implications are, and then to be able to iterate off that base. And that might sound a little bit, let's make it up as we go along. You can critique that as being a bit loose, but I think in all honesty, that's the only option we have in this space, right? We need to not be hubristic in terms of our sense that we've got this all worked out, because I don't think anybody would say that's the case, and instead be very open, very iterative, very adaptive, and try to create a space in which all the actors can have a conversation ongoing about how these technologies are unfolding and what we understand the risks and benefits to be, and the regulation can try to stay in touch with that as best it can.
Does that equate to a similar sort of regulatory posture as what we saw in the early .com era, where there was a fairly hands-off approach, let the innovation sort of happen, and then when we see obvious harms emerging, then we step in, but don't try to step in sort of preemptively? That seemed like a way to balance the equation of regulation versus innovation, very much in favor of innovation. Is that a fair statement?
I think that's right. Although I think that regulators possibly have learned a few things from the dot-com era as well. I would say that in relation to social media, as an example, where regulation has perhaps been a little bit too far behind, harms have really only been recognized really after the fact. And it's become rather difficult to close the gate because that horse has already bolted in a lot of ways in relation to social media. So I think we need to learn those lessons and to adopt as much of an anticipatory posture as we can, but recognizing that in the domain of AI, we're never going to be able to fully anticipate what's happening. We can only lean into the future as much as we're able. And then, as I say, adopt a very sort of adaptive, iterative kind of learning approach and work internationally. It's not the case that every government has to make this up from scratch. We can have much better ways of collaborating between regulators and, of course, the EU. I think that we can learn some lessons from the dot-com, but I don't think it's a carbon copy. I don't think regulators can say that was a success, particularly because there were many aspects of that where I think a lot of people would argue those technologies were under-regulated and the harms were not sufficiently anticipated, were not sufficiently understood and addressed. So I think with AI, we should do our best to learn the lessons from that era whilst recognizing it's still a challenge for sure.
I was wondering if you wouldn't mind commenting a little bit on the recent EU AI law as sort of a counter perspective on that, because it is less, let's see what happens, and as things develop, it has a lot to say around what needs to happen to keep things safe. I look at that as very interesting because you have between the US and the EU, probably China, those are large markets. And so the regulatory posture of those countries is going to very much impact the way that innovation and development happens here. But I think the sort of more laissez-faire, let it play out in the US versus the EU is an interesting dichotomy. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
It is. And these different regulatory approaches are to be expected because I think it's understandable that different jurisdictions are going to arrive at different balance points in terms of the sort of laissez-faire or tighter control. It'll be interesting to see the extent to which the more restrictive regulatory approach has the ability to flex as these technologies evolve, because it is just so difficult to anticipate even 1 year ahead, but let alone 5 years ahead, what these technologies will be capable of, what the implications of that will be for different elements of society. So I think if you are adopting a tighter regulatory model, then you'll have to be willing to sort of constantly update that, because whatever you've probably regulated for sort of 12 months ago's AI rather than 12 months into the future. And that's just, I don't think anyone would deny that, but that's just an inevitability of the slightly tighter approach.
Yes, and it seems like it will inevitably have a fairly significant effect on sort of international power dynamics. There's a concentration of AI development happening in very specific regions of the globe right now. Not sure if that's a benefit or a detriment or just an asterisk, but it definitely seems like depending on the regulatory posture and the model chosen, that's all up for grabs potentially.
I think that's right. Although it is interesting, I think, to compare and contrast the approach of, say, DeepMind with OpenAI, right? So if you are trying to regulate more of an AGI-oriented business model, then the stated goal of OpenAI is to create a human-level or better artificial intelligence. And the questions that surround that, the consequences of that, not just regulatory, but ethically, societally, economically, everything else are huge. And if OpenAI, of course, get anywhere close to that, then it's sort of all bets are off in a sense in terms of any of these domains. With DeepMind, if you point to models like AlphaFold, where they are more domain specific and that they are developing technologies which are as powerful, but oriented towards very specific goals, then that's a different regulatory challenge. That's about understanding how those technologies potentially could be applied to create harmful compounds, or if someone could get hold of that technology and use it to create a chemical weapon or something. But that's a very different type of regulatory challenge than the more general intelligence. And of course, these firms are all developing models which are both general and narrow in terms of their domain specificity. But again, from a regulator's point of view, that presents quite a wide waterfront in terms of how you think about limiting the harms and encouraging the benefits.
Last question on this regulatory posture before we flip gears here a little. Do you perceive there being a difference in how regulation of data owners versus algorithm and model developers should go? Or are they too tightly interwoven and so they sort of are one and the same thing?
Again, I think that could make sense for regulators to, if they can pass those two domains. I mean, I think sometimes it's a little bit tricky to know if we don't have the transparency. And you could say, well, look, the regulators need to demand this. But if we don't really have the full transparency on where the data is coming from that is training these models, or who owns the data that is training these models, then it's difficult to even sort of reach into that from a regulatory perspective. But I am sure that as the AI story unfolds, we will need to have quite a range of regulatory tools and specificities for different aspects of the technologies. It cannot be, it's very unlikely to be the case that one regulatory regime will be suitable, even for what I was just saying, like having an AGI type destination or having a very domain specific destination. Yeah, these feel like extremely different modes. And then data versus the models, the compute. There are all sorts of different dimensions to the AI story that you could choose to regulate more tightly or more loosely, depending on your attitude. And I think regulators have got a tough job in sort of wading through all that and deciding which of the levers to pull and which of the levers to maybe be a bit more liberal.
Flipping gears here a little bit, one of the topics that a lot of our listeners care greatly about has to do with the influence of AI in labor markets and with the sort of functions and utility of AI potentially disproportionately affecting lower income workers, automating away some of those jobs, and then the replacement of those jobs with new sectors that we may not even be able to predict yet, having that time delay between the two, creating some potential harms. What sort of frameworks or models or policies have you seen governments try to experiment with to directly address the potential labor force conversion that would need to happen with AI really gaining broad acceptance and adoption?
There's quite a good framing for this, which I've heard called the Turing Trap. And I think the economist is called Erik Bjørnofsson, but I might need to look that up after just to make sure I get you the correct reference. But the Turing Trap is along the lines that when we think about AI more in terms of the AGI version, so replacing humans and being able to do everything that humans can do, if as regulators, as policymakers, that we are captured by that particular lens, and as leaders in the private sector who are thinking about their workforce, then we tend to start to think very quickly of AI replacing humans, and exactly the scenario playing out that you were describing, where lots of people are going to lose their jobs because their jobs can be done by AI. The danger with that is that the people that can own or control, or at least capture the benefits from the AI, are set to capture a huge economic upside, and people who are relying on their labor to earn a living, which is most of everybody, are going to really suffer on average. The Turing Trap, though, says that is all based on this idea that AI can replace human beings wholly, at least in certain domains. And whilst that might be true in some circumstances, what's perhaps more likely, and I think if you look around empirically is true, is that for most people's jobs, you might be able to say AI can replace 20% of what I do, or 30%, or 40%, or even 50% of what I do, but it's very unlikely to be able to replace 100% of what I do. So rather than thinking about roles, jobs, we should think about tasks. And what are the sort of 10, 20 tasks that make up a particular role? And some of those tasks will be able to you'll hand them straight across to AI. And you could do that right now and say, hey, you do this particular task, which AI is well suited to do. But then there'll be other tasks which AI is actually requiring more of a partnership, let's say more of a collaboration model with the AI plus human approach. And then there'll be other tasks which really just do require a human to do. And the Turing Trap is that we tend to assume that everything is going to get automated, when in fact we should be thinking, how can we be more sophisticated about understanding these different types of tasks, and for sure taking away the stuff that we don't need to do anymore, but then making sure that the importance of human contribution is emphasized in the things where we do actually need a human being. If you think about medicine, that's a good example where radiographers do not have to spend the amount of time that they would have done in the past looking at scans to try to detect tumors or anomalies in the scans, because that can be done very well by AI. But AI is not going to get that right all of the time. It's going to require a human eye some of the time. And the interaction with the patient, you might say, it's going to be a while before patients feel comfortable not interacting with a human at all if they're talking about a cancer diagnosis or something like that. It can actually enhance the human role in the areas where humans have a role to play. and liberate them from having to do the stuff which is perhaps that little bit more routine and repeatable, and something where AI can actually do a much better job. That's the sort of attitude I'm describing there. In order to get there, one, there are things that governments could do. For example, at the moment, most tax regimes favor capital over labor. So if labor is taxed in a different way to capital investment, which kind of it's a thumb on the scales towards capital investment. So there's already a thumb on the scale right now to say, if you as a business have the opportunity to replace someone with a machine, you should replace them with the machine, because you have a more favorable tax arrangement if you do so. In a world of AI, why would you do that? Why would you put the thumb on the scale towards automation? Why would you not say, you know what, human beings are important as well, so let's either balance that out or put the thumb on the scale towards the human beings? That's just one simple thing that most countries' tax regimes currently do in one direction that we could flip around and do in the other. And if we look at those kinds of policy shifts, then I think this isn't a hopeless case where it's just inevitable that loads of people are going to either lose their jobs or find their wages being bid down. We can actually make some choices here, some real policy choices that actually tip the scales back in favor of labor and of human beings, basically.
I've even heard of some governments that have been looking at job retraining programs or sending people back to school free of charge as long as they meet certain criteria. And most of them that I've seen, you have to be over the age of 40. You have to be able to show that the AI or the automation has completely eliminated your job and that you were trained to do something prior. Maybe that's not the right solution for the long term, but for that short term period where the innovation is happening, but the labor market hasn't caught up yet, that could be an interesting way to sort of cross the chasm without too much human cost in the fray.
Yeah, and we've got examples from previous transitions. I'm British, from the UK. So when the coal mining industry was shut down, which is a fairly rapid transition, many people would argue that wasn't handled very well. There were not opportunities for people who had a livelihood one day, didn't have a livelihood the next, were basically not offered opportunities to retrain. There weren't other opportunities. And you just had a real problem with whole communities suffering from unemployment and all of the social challenges that come with that. So of course, we can learn the lessons of the past. But again, I'd say the most likely thing is not for everybody, but I think for a lot of people, AI isn't going to come after your job, but a person who is using AI might be able to come after your job. So it's placing the emphasis on the fact, of course, all of us, myself included, I use AI a lot as part of my work. We should be making use of these tools and asking, how can we be more efficient? How can this improve our decision-making? How can this make our work more enjoyable? Actually allow us to focus on the stuff which is more, potentially creative, that is more about interacting with other humans, about doing things that machines can't do, and not think about this as sort of, my job is going to be 100% replaced. Because I think the likely scenario, at least in the next 5 to 10 years, is that most people, that won't be the reality, actually.
I agree with you for sure. It does strike me that a lot of what we're talking about requires you to be able to measure progress or some sort of intervention in some way. And so that makes me think about, what metrics should governments be looking at when they're evaluating AI and trying to make their determinations about economic or social benefits and harms? What metrics have you seen really effective in terms of measuring when there's something we need to be paying attention to for better or for worse?
It's a good question. And I'm not sure the metrics we need to look at are that different from the metrics we already have for understanding the impact of policy without AI. So of course, we have a wide range of economic and societal metrics that we can look at to understand how wealth is distributed. We can look at inequality metrics. We can look at how labor is distributed or transformed. So we already know how to measure these kinds of things. I think the question is, are we measuring that stuff quickly enough, given how fast these technologies are adapting? So if we used to have like an annual survey or a biannual, maybe that just isn't quite up to speed now if these technologies are really rapidly changing the workforce. And I guess, are we looking at that data and combining it with the right kind of insight? So perhaps in the past, we used to look at that data for one purpose, for, I don't know, calculating GDP or something. But now maybe we need to look at that data with the AI lens and say, okay, now we can use this data for something which is slightly different from what we've used it in the past, but it's actually going to inform how we maybe choose to regulate these technologies. So back to the point around taxation, for example, maybe we used to look at capital formation and measure that in an economy And we'd be cheering that along because that would be showing businesses investing in capital. And that's a good thing for sort of future growth. But in an AI world, we might say, well, that's actually data we need to look at in a slightly different way, because if that is about actually sort of substituting technology for human beings, we need to interpret that with perhaps a little bit more nuance than the way we've looked at it in the past. So I would say the data we have is perhaps we already know the kinds of things we need to measure to understand the impact of policy on society, but we might need to look at it slightly differently and in a slightly different context when it comes to AI.
Makes a ton of sense. One of the first examples that comes to mind as you were walking us through that was how building trust in government is a very uphill battle a lot of times. And anytime you introduce a new capability such as AI, there's obviously that inflection point where trust in government could really go either way, and transparency, AI ethics, all of that sort of stuff is part of this broader conversation. What sort of strategies have you seen implemented with some degree of success to try to take on some of those very, very difficult and challenging topics?
So there are a number of governments that have now very explicitly taken the AI ethics topic head on and formed working groups or held conferences and other gatherings where they've said, we need to start talking about this topic. We need to start sort of defining what the boundaries look like, what the red lines are for society, and use those conversations to both inform the regulatory conversation that we were talking about earlier and to help inform that wider public discourse about make sure we have a sort of common understanding of these technologies and then what we feel is acceptable or not acceptable. So I think that there have been a number of jurisdictions that have already started to sort of very explicitly and very publicly set up these forums or working groups that are explicitly about ethics. The other thing I think that's important for governments to do, and we see good examples of, is to be willing to get into sort of demonstration projects, I suppose you might call them. So actually, rather than just talking about the possibility of things, like exploring the reality in a particular domain, in a particular perhaps narrow space, in a more controlled environment, actually start to trial some of these technologies and then use that to inform the conversation around the ethical considerations or limitations. So again, using the UK as an example, because DeepMind happened to be based there, right? DeepMind have had a reasonably long, in AI terms now, multi-year partnership with the National Health Service there to apply their technologies to certain aspects of diagnosis, I think in particular, and asking how are these technologies not just performing in terms of are they better than the human being or how can they work in partnership with a human being, but also how do people feel about that? How do the people that work in the NHS feel about that? How do patients feel about that? What should the laws that protect people look like in relation to this with privacy or transparency concerns, for example? So at the moment, I think it's correct to say that whilst you can use an algorithm to help diagnose a condition in the National Health Service, you will always still need a human to make the final call. That's how the law stands right now. Now, that might not be the right place for the line to be drawn at some point in the future. For sure, these technologies are going to improve. But it's a much more informed debate if we actually are trialing this and saying, okay, this is how this currently works. This is how the medical profession and patients are currently receiving that, reacting to that. Let's continue to listen and learn and adapt on that basis. And then that will help us to draw these sort of ethical boundaries more finely in the future. And that's much easier to do from real experience than from just theoretical or conceptual discussion.
If I'm hearing you correctly, leaning into that government's sense-making power as a trust-fostering, trust-building mechanism is a perspective I don't believe we've had shared on the podcast before, and I think that's really fascinating. A lot of people sort of are critical of governments behaving with soft power, but I would say the results tend to be a little bit more long-lasting and a little bit more humanized, which in this context is seemingly exactly what people are looking for, which is really profound.
Yeah, I can critique governments a lot. Professionally, I spend a lot of my time pointing out the flaws in different things that governments do. But when it comes to a topic like AI, who else are we going to turn to help us as a society sort of feel our way through this next period, if it is going to be as rapid and as potentially profound as some of us anticipate it will be? We're not going to rely, I don't think any of us want to rely on the AI firms to do that, right? However well-meaning, with we think they might be. I don't think we can rely on big tech to help us feel our way through this. I don't think we can rely on the media or any other voice in society necessarily. And with all of their limitations and flaws and the bureaucracy and everything else that comes along with it, governments are the place where the different interests in society can be weighed up against one another, and collectively, at least in theory, we can arrive at some conclusions for now about how we like to strike that balance. And that's one of the important roles that government plays. So for sure, in relation to AI, being able to hold that space, being able to convene that conversation, be able to bring these very powerful players to the table and hold them to account to some extent about what they're doing and what they anticipate the changes will look like in the future. That is a role that government can play that is potentially the most important one in relation to AI, given the potential impact that we might expect.
I love that. You have accomplished something highly challenging, which is making me emerge towards the end of our discussion optimistic about government's role in AI and how it's going to function. Those are profound words, and I really love your perspective on it. As a means of concluding this, I always like to give our guests the last word here. One of the things that we really focus in on our podcast, and we have a lot of policymakers and lawmakers who are our listeners. And so I always like to afford our guests the opportunity, if you had the ability, to provide them with some advice, some things that they need to be paying attention to or issues they need to remain sensitive to. What would you do to steer their attention towards the right sort of topics now?
Well, as we were discussing earlier, I think it's an exciting time and it's a challenging time. If you're in one of those positions of responsibility as a regulator, as a policymaker, as somebody who is making decisions about how the rest of our lives will be shaped by these technologies for better or for worse, I think they need to, if I was to give advice or in the broadest sense, I think they need to be able to walk and chew gum, by which I mean they need to do two sort of slightly different things simultaneously. On the one hand, I think it is important that they have a grasp on the here and now, how these technologies are actually playing out for real in society, and are able to have some sort of response to that. Not necessarily a regulatory response, but a response that says, look, we are listening, we are learning, we are understanding, and we are doing where we're seeing harms, we are taking note, we are seeking to address those harms, and where we're seeing opportunities for economic growth, to improve all of our lives in one way or another, that we are removing the barriers to those improvements coming forward. And that's a kind of here and now continuous role for these folk. But then simultaneously, they need to be able to cast their minds that 5 or 10 year horizon into the future. Because if you're constantly just thinking of the here and now and you're constantly just reacting to sort of what the latest release or the latest technology that's coming down the track, then you are not doing the other part of your role, which is to say, we're trying to anticipate where this is heading. We're trying to spot those trends, do that sort of future visioning, which is so difficult. I'm pretending this is easy, but somebody needs to be looking down the track and saying, well, look, if these technologies continue down this path, if, as we expect, we're going to see the following gains in power and in let's say, the reductions in cost of these models over the next few years, then this might be where we're going to end up. Realistic scenarios in 5 or 10 years' time. And that's where you can start to make anticipatory either moves or at least signals, let's say, to one of my earlier points around the taxation regime, where you say, actually, we're already anticipating that we might need to shift the balance a little bit to more towards labor in order to encourage people to retain people in work, because we think that's going to be important in 5 to 10 years. And we're already thinking about that. Not that we've got the answer, not that we know it's exactly what's going to happen, but we are at least casting our mind forward in that 5 to 10 year horizon. So you need to be able to do both at the same time. You need to be able to both respond to the here and now and to be able to have that conversation about what's coming down the track. And that is difficult. Maybe different people have different roles to play in that. But as a government, if you've got responsibility for the regulatory regime, or you've got responsibility for steering these technologies in one way or another, you do really need to do both. And yeah, that would be my plea.
Profound stuff, Adrian. Really appreciate your insights. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with our listeners today. And for the rest of our audience, we'll see you next time.
Thanks so much.
AI, Government and the Future is brought to you by Corner Alliance. To find out more about Corner Alliance and how we work with government to create results, visit our website at corneralliance.com. And then make sure to search for AI Government Future in Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. And click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Corner Alliance, thanks for listening.